good.
I'm
great. Loving this weather.
Yeah, you just came from DC, right?
I just came from DC, where it was actually 80 degrees when I left, and I've been gone from Chicago since 2012. So I know this is warm for y'all. I had a little bit of a weather shock here.
I know, what a day to be here on St. Patrick's Day. So I'm really thrilled to be talking to you. I was really excited to be asked to converse with you, someone who I think is really a living legend, a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist, someone who, a breaker of glass ceilings, a leader and mentor to many. So, and of course, a Chicago native, and so it's not even just like a speech; it's a homecoming of sorts. So I'm gonna read off Kimbriell's formal bio so you can get to know her. Kimbriell Kelly is the assistant managing editor and Washington bureau chief at the Los Angeles Times, where she oversees coverage of politics and policy in Washington, D.C. Kimbriell led the bureau's coverage of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, the 2020 Trump election challenge, and in her first year as bureau chief, launched 3 successful series, The United States of California, covering Kamala Harris, and Extreme Heat. She is the first person of color and the second woman to lead the bureau. Prior to joining the LA Times, Kimbriell was an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, where she was part of the team that won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for the series Fatal Force, uncovering the FBI's undercounting of fatal officer-involved shootings. She was a 2019 Pulitzer finalist for Murder with Impunity, a year-long examination of unsolved homicides across major cities in America. Before moving to Washington, Kimbriell was a reporter, editor, and publisher in Metro Chicago for almost 15 years at the Daily Herald and the Chicago Reporter. She has taught at Princeton University, UC Berkeley, Roosevelt University, and American University. Kimbriell, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Kimbriell, would you be able to start off by telling us more about your path to investigative journalism?
I think it was kind of an accidental path. When I was at the Daily Herald, I was like 22 or 23 years old, and I just would question everything. And I remember I heard about this thing called public records, and so I was like, let me see if I could file one. I was covering the village of Hoffman Estates, if anybody knows, out by Schaumburg. Woohoo! All right, suburban reporters. All right. So I was like, they're opening the pools. I wonder how safe these pools are. Like, what are the chlorine levels like? What are the bacteria levels like? So I innocently filed this public records request, not because I was an investigative reporter, but just because I was curious. And so I'm speaking to this room because I'm guessing there's a lot of curious people in here. Yes, thank you for raising your hand. So I was curious, like, are kids actually safe on Memorial Day when all these suburban pools are going to open? So I sent in my public records request. We didn't have Google then, so I had to figure out how to do that and read some books. And I was so proud of myself. I was like, I think I literally was like early, mid-20s. And I sent it in, and the spokesperson for the park district, I'll never forget her, Sue Olafson, called me.
Oh, you know her name?
I will never forget the story. Was upset with me. I thought we had a good relationship. You come to our board meetings, we get along. What's the problem? I said, what do you mean? She's like, you asked all these questions. You sent this public records request. Something's got to be wrong. Are you investigating us? And I was like scared. I hadn't expected that reaction. And I'm going to be honest, it put me off of public records requests for years.
What were the pools like?
I never got the response back. I think I just kind of let it go. And if there's any lesson that you take out of this today, which I have learned in my career, is never let it go. If you learn nothing else today, don't let it go. Mike talked about me as being a bulldog. Yeah, I'm a bulldog that smiles, because I don't let it go now. That changed my life. So yes, I remember her name. I remember the public records request. I remember being scared. I remember feeling all the feelings. What I would have done differently if I had done this today is said to Sue, yeah, I get along with you all really great. My job is to hold the government accountable. So you have 20 days to respond to my public records request. I look forward to getting the records. Thank you.
I love that. Can you tell me about your experience at the Chicago Reporter? You ended up, you started as a reporter, you ended up the publisher and the editor, right?
I did. So at the time, it was in 2004, my boss, my former boss, Alden Lowry, who's amazing and a genius. If you do not know him, start following him immediately on Twitter. They had a one-year McCormick Tribune Fellowship in Urban Reporting, which was phenomenal. And I, at the time, was applying for jobs at the Washington Post, making headway, but the Post and others during that year, in 2004, 2005, were having their own reckoning, and they were having like buyouts and layoffs, similar to what's happening in our industry right now. And so the job that I was being considered for was kind of put on hold. So I was trying to make this decision. Do I stay at the Daily Herald, where I was an investigative reporter, but I had started doing investigative type stories, I just didn't have that title? Or do I go to some place, huge pay cut, we joke about this, like huge pay cut, in 2004 for this fellowship where I would be able to officially become an investigative reporter. I'd be able to do all those stories on the list that I never was able to accomplish as a daily reporter.
Like what?
I'm gonna tell you in a second.
Okay.
I'll tell you. So, like when you're a daily reporter, you're in the daily grind, right? And you're kind of like hyped up on adrenaline. So you don't have much time to do those enterprise stories, right? The enterprise stories are the ones that are gonna get you hired at your next place. Tip number 2, do the stories. Even if you only do 1 a quarter, that's 4 a year, that's enough for your resume to get the next job. So, pull yourself away from the daily reporting. So I applied for this 1-year job, and Alden and I were joking, because the Washington Post had said, we'd love to see more enterprise and investigative stuff in your portfolio. You're clearly curious about this. So I said, all right, it's a 1-year fellowship, it's low pay, I just got married, and I told my boss, I was like, I'm only gonna be here 1 year. I think I told him this like every week that I was there. Like, no joke. So I went there and I did this investigation. He's like, well, write whatever you want to write. So I was like, I want to write about housing. I'm super curious about this. So I went to the South Side of Chicago because remember, those questions in your head, those are stories, y'all. Write them down. The things you observe, they're stories. So I went to the South Side at the time, and in 2004, a lot of the public housing was coming down, Cabrini, everything was coming down. And so you saw this massive move and shift for gentrification, right? But there were certain people who were being left out, and it was the height of the subprime lending crisis before it was actually formalized, right? That people knew it was happening. So I remember going to these neighborhoods, talking to people, African American, who were like bawling, y'all, like making all sorts of money, and could not get approved for like a $40,000 loan. Had like 6 figures in the bank in their savings account. And so what's the question I asked myself? Why? At the time, I was making, can I say what I was making at the time? I was making $32,000 at the Chicago Reporter. And I was like, could not even dream of making 6 figures, let alone having 6 figures in my bank account, and then applying for a home for $40,000 and getting told no. Who are these people? So that why was in my head, right? That's where you come in. You have to answer the why. Answering the why is not easy. It's not easy, right? So that's what prompted me into my first investigation. So I did that investigation, long story short. That caught the attention of the state attorney general at the time. Y'all may know her, Lisa Madigan. She decided to file a lawsuit against those lenders, Countrywide and Wells Fargo. She then joined forces with, I think, 9 other states at the time in that settlement, and then it eventually got picked up by the federal government, the Department of Justice, and they filed a settlement, a multi-million-dollar settlement, and the largest fair housing settlement in the country.
That's incredible. And you spent 15 years of your career in Chicago working at the Daily Herald, and you had a weekly show at DZ, you worked at the Chicago Reporter. I was curious how being from Chicago and starting your career here has informed your later experiences at these national newsrooms.
Wow, Chicago has incredible journalists here, and journalists with amazing heart. There's so many issues here. everyday issues, but also systemic, deeply systemic issues that need investigating. And as you see what's happening in the industry, there are more and more reporters getting out of the business, and there are fewer jobs. And so that means that a lot of these issues still remain uninvestigated. So Chicago has that. Not that every other city doesn't have that, but Chicago, like, y'all are dogged, like, for reals. When you live in a place like Washington, D.C., there's a different conversation, right? It's about national news. I was talking to Monica about just like politics today. She's like, oh, are you going to talk about national politics? I was like, I don't think this crowd really want to hear about the national politics right now. But you know, there's a different conversation that's happening here around the primaries and who gets to decide and who has power, right? That's very different than what's entirely happening on the national landscape. So when I go to the Washington Post, I'm bringing my experience from being at the Chicago Reporter and focusing on very like nitty-gritty neighborhood type of issues to pulling back and focusing on like a 30,000 foot conversation, like what's happening across the country. And so I would say what from Chicago helped me inform my reporting there is the importance of when you have a national conversation, and I've shown this in my work at the Washington Post with every investigation, drill down to the cities. Drill down to not just the quintessential cities like LA, Detroit, Miami, right? You know, you get your three. You know, that's the trick if you want to do a national story. You pick a city on the West Coast, East Coast, South, Midwest, and compare it to your city. Bada boom, you got the national story. Chicago made me realize what's happening in cities is complicated. From city to city, you can't just have one big story on mortgage lending and assuming that that's happening everywhere. And I found that out and I've done that in every investigation, both in Fatal Force, Fired, Rehired. I drilled down and I filed FOIAs with 50 of the major cities in the country. When I did Murder with Impunity, we did the same, 50 major cities. What I learned in doing it with Murder with Impunity, just as an example, Chicago, let me take a step back. Proof of concept, if you're taking notes. I always apply a proof of concept for any investigation that I do. There's usually 5 criteria that I decide if I want to do an investigation. It's like harm, scope, potential for impact, unique story, broken system. Those are my 5. If you ever ask me what are my criteria for choosing an investigative story, that's 5. Story's got to include all 5. Then I take a step back, and instead of launching into a fishing expedition, I like to say, what's my proof of concept story? What story can I kind of test the waters to see if there's a full-throated investigation here? And so I did that in Chicago for Murder with Impunity. Our editors, I was working with Wes Lowry, some of you guys may know him, and the numbers of murders were on the rise in Chicago. And the Washington Post wanted to write about it, and they're like, oh, you know, murders are increasing in Chicago, right? You know, the whole national conversation about Chicago and crime, right? So that lands differently when you're from that place. So when a national editor is like, oh, come and write about this, you're like, it's probably complicated. And so they're like, well, you're from there, so can you go and write this story? And I literally said to my editors, and I'm pretty certain I called Alden up to tell him, y'all are not about to embarrass me in my hometown. Like, they already hate helicopter journalism in Chicago. Like, probably one of the biggest cities that hate helicopter journalists. You're gonna take a person who's from there, come back, and do a national, like, sweepy story? Absolutely not. We have to find a new angle. But they're like, you have 2 weeks. I was like, oh my gosh. So I literally went Chicago reporter style and said, okay, what story hasn't been told? Because Chicago reporters have told all the stories. So I went back and I said, the data has to be over a longer period of time, because I looked, I need to do a proof of concept. So I read all the stories that had been written, and I noticed that so many crime trends were changing from like year to year. So when it was being reported, it was only being reported from year to year. There wasn't like a very longitudinal look. Like, and if it was like 5 years or 10 years, because the city had changed how they aggregated data or how much data was going to be released. So I was like, oh, there's never been this like 20-year look or 10-year look in this specific kind of reporting. The second thing that we noticed was that all the crime statistics were focused on, so I'm looking for the unique thing. Remember, one of the 5, unique story. Everyone's writing about the increase of crime, But who's writing about if those crimes are actually getting solved? It's a different question. The solve rate. What we realized was the solve rate was being kind of aggregated globally or like by a larger swath of the neighborhood, of the area, like north side, south side, west side, right? But in your neighborhood, you couldn't go and click on an area and see what the solve rate was. So we decided, let's see if we can do this in 2 weeks. So if I'm going off of unique criteria, I need to do 10 to 20 years. I need to focus on solve rate. I want to contribute something new to the Chicago ecosystem, right? If I want to talk about a broken system, that's the solve rate also. If I want to talk about harm, I need to talk about the people who are impacted most. So I decided to go and request 20 years of solve rate data from the Chicago Police Department. All right, I hear all my crime reporters laughing here, or government reporters. So I literally put the request in, and it was like fall, so it was the first week of school, so all the police officers were where? On the street, walking kids to school. Great, so you're telling me nobody's doing anything with my FOIA request? Yes. Okay, well I got like 2 weeks, and I need it now. This is what Mike was talking about. This is the bulldog part. I literally argued my way up to the head of R&D, who went and hand-pulled these records for me because everybody else was out on the streets, pulled it, sent it to me in the database form. I had the audacity to say he did it wrong and do it again, and I'm on a time limit. He was nice, and he did it again, shockingly, and I got those records. And I wanted them by neighborhood. Now, I had so much opposition, 1, to even getting them, 2, to getting them quickly, 3, at the time, the police department was starting to put their records online. You guys remember this? But it was this time when they put it online, but they wanted you to take what was online, and if you wanted to modify it, they, like at the time, they're like, it's online. Like that was their excuse. And so I was dealing with that. They're like, oh, all these crimes are online. I was like, I need the solve rate. The solve part, an arrest was made, that part. That's what I need, and I need 20 years. So ultimately, he redid the information. I mean, the head of R&D was so nice, actually, I can't even complain, and got it back to me. I also kill people with kindness. Jason Leopold, shout out, major public records, like genius out there. He and I have totally different distinctive ways of getting public records. He asks for everything, and he's the hammer, y'all. He ain't trying to be nice. He is so effective. I am like the kill him with kindness, but give me my records. So I got the records, 20 years of data, and what it showed was actually shocking. There were neighborhoods, I think, I ended up focusing on Inglewood, and remember, this is just my proof of concept story, y'all. This ain't an investigation. This is just the story to see if there's something else there. And so I got those records, and I found a neighborhood in Inglewood that the solve rate was like, I think 0.8%.
That's terrible.
No, it was 8%. Either numbers, it was 8%. Y'all, either is terrible. So what does 8% mean to you guys? Less than a tenth. That's a way to describe it in a story. What's another way to say it?
Absolutely abysmal on the part of the CPD.
92 families without closure out of 100.
All right, say it even more simply. 1 out of 10. Is it 1 out of 10? It's less than 1 out of 10, y'all. What is that in a story? What's the line? This is a neighborhood where almost no murders are solved. Then you can put the number. Say it plainly. Say what is. Say what the numbers say. This is a neighborhood where you live. I just got chills just remembering doing that story. This is a neighborhood where if you get murdered, nobody is going to solve that crime. You say it. That's what public records are for. The data say one thing. You have to convert it to an audience who can understand that data. And so that was our proof of concept. We did that story. It blew up. The Washington Post was like, we're going to do a whole series on this. We did a whole series on this, and that ultimately ended up in the series that was finalist for the Pulitzer. We came in second to the Trump taxes. We're like, we'll take it. to get the country focused on murder and homicides, unsolved homicides. And we scaled that story to the 50 largest cities in America, and we found out that the solve rate was 50-50, that across America, the chances of the worst crime, the most heinous crime getting solved was only 50-50 in America. So that's how Chicago has informed my national reporting.
And can you tell us about your Fatal Force project that also was that won the Pulitzer in 2016? You were working on that with Wes Lowry and some other folks as well.
Yeah, and that we worked, I worked with Kimbriell Kelly on the first part of that series, and it was kind of funny because before it was like 1 or 2 weeks before the series launched, and this was after everything happened with Michael Brown. Like, so many reporters are like, why are you guys working on this series? Like, that story is so old, it's passé, nobody cares about it anymore. It's hard reporting on issues that you think nobody cares about. And we're like, we're gonna keep pushing forward. And then all of a sudden, I think it was a Michael Schlager shooting on video. It was caught and it captivated the nation. And all of a sudden it was back in the national conversation again, and our editor's like, how quickly can we get this story in? And that was the first story that was launched for the Fatal Force series. It took us 6 months of public records, sending $2 checks to little places, but we were trying to aggregate the number of for officers who are investigated for these officer-involved shootings, how many actually get prosecuted? Like the question, right? Does anybody get prosecuted?
No.
Well, our reporting showed that. Yes. Yes. But we showed that systematically right across the country too. Like, people could know in different places. But not only did they not get prosecuted, we wanted to find out what happens when they do go to court, when they do get prosecuted, when they, and we found out, I think it was like 1% ended up in some sort of like getting prosecuted, but then also convictions was like even in lower. So that launched the series, and then Wes and others there had this big idea, let's do a database chronicling all of the officer-involved shootings across the country. And that, I think, was the thing that really won over folks for the Pulitzer, was that the FBI had undercounted the number of shootings by half. And here was the FBI who's supposed to be tracking it because it was like voluntary. And so that, I think, continued to lead into other police reporting for us, but then we did win the Pulitzer that year.
And can you tell us more about your recent work leading the Washington Bureau of the LA Times? You mentioned in your bio that you're the first person of color to lead the Bureau, the second woman. What does that mean for you?
A lot of work. I mean, it's great, right? It's funny, my boss had to be the one that told me that. I actually hadn't realized it, because I'm just like, oh yeah, I came to this place, the LA Times, I was looking to get into editing again. So I left the Washington Post as a reporter, and I became an editor in the Washington Bureau. Well, I was working on investigations, and then several months later, it was like less than a year later, they're like, can you run the Bureau? And I was like, no. And I was like, I came to do this investigative editing job. But then I eventually decided to say yes. And it was a great decision. I was telling Alden, it advanced my management experience exponentially because I didn't realize I was going to be the second woman. The first woman, apparently, I have to fact check this, but what I was told was that she was in the job for about a month. So I was like,
so
yeah.
Effectively the first woman as well.
I like to say the first woman longer than 30 days. So yeah, effectively the first woman, essentially the first person of color, and since the 1940s. I mean, this is Washington for a California paper. I mean, that's pretty significant, right? So it was a great responsibility. So you have the job of actually running the office. You have the job of trying to make sense of politics at a time when politics was crazy and chaotic. During the Trump administration and then during the Biden administration, have to switch to almost a different kind of reporting philosophy, right? And then you have this other great challenge. I'm an optimist. So you have this other great challenge of saying, whatever's happening in Washington, I have to be able to translate it for a West Coast audience, which is very different, right? And California is very, very different. Your story is going to hit differently in Northern California than it is in Southern California or Mid-Coast or the Inland Empire, and et cetera, San Diego, right? That's hard, y'all. That's really hard. And so one of the things I started doing was trying to figure out, what do our readers want from Washington? United States to California was an outgrowth of that. Covering Kamala Harris was an outgrowth of that. Why? Across the country, when you said Kamala Harris, people were like, Harris, They didn't really care too much for her, right? In California, for some reason, every time we wrote about Kamala Harris, like, it drove up traffic. People still could be meh about her, but they, like, loved reading about her. She was the hometown girl. And so my job was trying to reconcile that with, like, a national audience who was like, you know. And so I launched Covering Kamala Harris, and it was a hit for our California audience. And I was like, you know, while the country is focusing on her in a very different way, we wanted to focus on her as a human, right? As a person who was from California, who made decisions, some that were very controversial, to say the least, and others really putting her in the space of her hometown. Like, we just, you know, did a really sit-down interview, the first interview as a couple, her and Doug, you know, and we did their favorite things, and it went gangbusters, like the candles she buys, like, that's what you have to do for your audience once you know what your audience is. And so I think that was probably one of the hardest parts about working, you know, in Washington for a publication it's not necessarily in Washington. But it's been a fantastic experience. I like to say, both being a trailblazer, both being a boss, but also just trying to be somebody who elevates my staff. And one of the most important things was diversifying our staff. When I got there, our staff was not very diverse. I've said this a million times, but we had a staff of, I think we didn't have any Latino reporters.
For a California paper. It's wild.
We didn't have any African American reporters. We only had one reporter of color, now that I think about it. So, covering a daily beat. And I said, we gotta change this. Like, we gotta be proud of this. We gotta, like, what's the issue? And I immediately diversified the staff, both gender, race and ethnicity. At the time, we didn't have any, and I've talked about this a million times before, but we didn't have any women covering the White House. We didn't have any people of color covering the White House or Congress, or in any of the national, like the premier national beats. And within a year, I changed that to where, you know, the vast majority of people covering the White House were people of color, were women. We also diversified and had people of color covering Congress and in those national political reporting beats. And it was important to represent where we were from, right? But you can't just say you want to, you have to actually do the hard work. And it wasn't easy, let me tell you. And it wasn't what I thought I had signed up for. I'd signed up to be an investigative editor. But it also was probably one of the most rewarding experiences of my career.
So it's as you know, it's an election year. I'm curious what your experience has been like covering this election cycle now, and also thinking about the Chicago context, how you feel national and international politics are affecting Chicagoans, and how Chicagoans, vice versa, are affecting politics at the national level.
Yeah, who knows how it's going to turn out? Like, I always say, like, you know, we could have Trump in the White House, we could have Biden remaining in the White House. Like, I feel like you just have to be open to both possibilities. It's interesting how many people I talk to, and they're convinced it's going to be one or the other. And I'm just like, it's a toss-up at this point. But you have to prepare for either one. So I think here the conversation is going to be much different. I mean, obviously you guys are focusing on the primaries heavily. That's going to determine a lot. But also protest coverage was big during the Trump administration when he came here. And Pence. So, you know, when I think that'll be a big issue again. You know, Chicago protests, covering that and figuring out how you can create, you know, stories out of that. In terms of FOIAs and public records, though, people may want to talk about like what that coverage looked like in prior years to add some more context to it today. the migrant crisis and what's happening across the country, I don't think that there's enough coverage coming out of the Midwest. I wish there was more. I mean, I think you see it popping up. I mean, think about it. Everything you hear is largely reported on the edges of the country, on the East Coast, on the San Diego, Arizona, Texas, now a little bit on Canada. I think a lot more coverage of the interior and depth in a way that's very like sweepy but also illuminating, but digs down into granular stories would be very smart. But also storytelling, y'all. Narrative storytelling is like just the way to go. People's attention spans are so limited right now. So audio reporting, reporting on TikTok, reporting your stories in a very compelling way to put people in the shoes of where you are, and just like describing place is so important.
And I'm also curious to know if you have any advice for early career reporters here in the room who want to be investigative journalists.
So I know our time is limited, so see me afterwards or reach out to me on Twitter and we can talk more. But I think I was talking to Monica's daughter earlier today, and we were having a conversation about is it worth it to go into journalism, right? The money is it's not that great. The job opportunities are few. And the thing I said to her is like, yes, those things are all true. We didn't get into this for the money. And I just kind of told her the story about when I took the job at the Chicago Reporter, making $32,000. And at the time, I was living 2 hours away. It was a 2-hour commute. I was living in the far, far, far northwest suburbs. And I mean, it was darn near to Rockford. And I got on the train, a bus, walked. I did everything but take a plane to work. And it took me between 2 and 2.5 hours to commute one way. And it was a 7-hour workday. So I commuted like 5 hours of a 7-hour workday. And it was the best job, one of the best jobs of my life. And so I say to you, like, go in with information to make choices about your careers, knowing that the money, it may take a little bit longer to get jobs. It may not be a ton of money, but I ended up staying beyond that 1 year.
You were there for 7 years?
I stayed there 7-8 years because what kept me there was the passion and the work that I was doing. And I will tell you this, that waking up, that 2-hour commute was nothing. I ended up talking to my bosses and said, can I work also on the train? And he said, yeah. Like, I just woke up on fire to go to work, and it was not about the money. I was shopping at thrift stores. He knows this, my boss. Like, all 7 of those years. I stopped at thrift stores. I just got rid of the clothes 2 weeks ago. And it was like one of the best times of my entire life. I was winning awards, and I'm wearing like $2 jeans off the like bulk rack, and I would never have changed that. And it wasn't about the money. The money eventually will come later if that's what you want. The prestige will come later. If you focus on doing the work, the Pulitzers, all that stuff came. I didn't try to get those things. They came because I was focused on being passionate about what I do. So I would say that. But then also, like, decide what you're really good at. Like, just really do a hard assessment with you and your friends who know you really well. And just if you're a daily reporter, you're really good at daily reporter, but you love doing like audio pieces or pieces centered on families or decide that that's what you're going to do and pursue that.
Well, we're out of time. Kimbriell, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you. It's been great being here.
Kimbriell will be around for the rest of the day, so feel free to come up to her with any questions. But otherwise, I hope you all enjoy FOIA Fest.
Thanks, everyone.